DiMaggio?
I think we'll get started now. If everyone,
Oh, yeah.
as you settle into your seats. I'm Kate Tuttle. I'm moderating this panel with these distinguished writers, journalists, one historian. As I said, I'm Kate Tuttle, and from left to right, on your left to right, is David Maraniss, Jane Leavy, and Arnold Rampersad. You'll find really full biographies of all three of them in your programs. I can't begin to introduce them. They all have so many great books to their credit. I thought I would start, though, since all three of these people have written extraordinary biographies of baseball players, to ask each of them to tell me some of their first memories of baseball and some of their favorite players when they were growing up.
You want me to start?
Sure.
Well, it's not a memory, but the legend in my family. My father grew up in Brooklyn and was a huge Dodgers fan before they moved to LA, when he gave them up forever. But in 1951, the famous shot heard round the world by Bobby Thompson, which the speaker last night said he'd never heard of, so it wasn't all the way around the world. We were in Detroit. I was not quite 2. My father was holding me in his hands, and the family legend is he was so upset when Bobby Thompson hit that home run that beat the Dodgers that he dropped me. The other legend is that he just threw some crackers. So I say I'd go in with the crackers, but by the time I was conscious of baseball, the Dodgers weren't that. We hated some teams. We didn't like the Yankees because we were from, he was from Brooklyn, and Jane will love the Yankees. And we also hated the Boston Red Sox because they were the last team to integrate. And my father taught us racial justice from a very early age, so the Red Sox were verboten in our family. But my favorite player, I had 2 favorite players as a kid, and we moved to Madison, Wisconsin in 1957. My father had just survived 5 years on the blacklist, and he got a job in Madison. And we arrived there in that summer. And so our lives were saved. It was a magical summer. The Milwaukee Braves were on their way to winning the pennant and then the World Series. So Hank Aaron was my first baseball hero. But my favorite player always was someone I eventually got a chance to write about, Roberto Clemente.
Nice.
He was the coolest player I'd ever seen. The way he wore his uniform, the way he threw the ball and walked to the plate, everything about him. And also, he was a hypochondriac. And so am I. So I was able to identify with him right away. So I would say Clemente and Aaron were my earliest memories.
What about you, Jane?
Well, growing up in New York, you had to be either a Willie guy or a Mickey guy or a Duke guy, and I was a Mickey guy. My dad, however, was a Willie guy and would torture me every day by bringing home the New York Post, throwing it down and saying, "Look what Willie did." And I would grab the New York Post and say, "Look what Mickey did." And though he hated the Yankees desperately, he had been the water boy for the New York football giants and the baseball giants because his father, who was a bookie and a rum runner, supplied all the booze for the polo grounds. So he wasn't leaving his allegiance to them, but he nonetheless took me to Yankee Stadium. And one particular day that some of you who are Mickey Mantle fans or Yankee fans may remember, in May of 1962, it's a year after Roger Maris beats Babe Ruth's record, albeit in more games. I think Babe really still holds the record in 154 games, but that's okay. And Mickey tried to beat out a meaningless ground ball hit to the shortstop. It was for the Minnesota Twins, and he saw the guy bobble the ball. And so he tried to summon the speed that he once had before injuries completely decimated his body. And in trying to do so, he tore muscle off bone and collapsed, in the baseline with his fingers reaching for the bag. And basically, he would never be the same. He would never be the same after 1951, when Joe DiMaggio ran him off Willie Mays' tepid fly ball in right center field, and Joe DiMaggio didn't bother to call for the ball, and Mickey's spike caught on the drain, which the which the groundskeeper had forgotten to put the top on. So he played his entire career as a what if. What if he had been whole? And I identified with that because I was born, well, actually, I was conceived the day he hit his first major league home run. Against the White Sox, I might add. And I was born prematurely, and I had similar issues to Mickey, so I identified with him having to struggle to be the best he could, knowing he would never be as good as he might have been had that first injury not taken place. And of course, I ultimately interviewed Mickey at the Atlantic City Hotel where my mother lost her virginity on December 25th, 1941.
Your family's very open about their sexual histories.
I think that was the only time, well, never mind. And my childhood ended when Mickey Mantle collapsed face first in my lap while his large slugger's hand was creeping up the inside of my thigh. Thankfully, he passed out before it got to the promised land. And I literally went upstairs and cried. And I called the only person I knew who would be up at 3 in the morning, a lactating mother, and said, my childhood is over. You know, he's not what I thought he was. And if there's ever an exercise in understanding the difference between myth and the reality of a person and a player who I would come to understand, he owned his flaws, ultimately. He got sober, which is a very hard thing to do, particularly when you're dying of liver cancer. And he was sexually abused as a kid, blah, 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 blah. So I kind of, people ask me, is he still your guy? And I say, no, he's a guy. And that's better, to have him in proportion.
Wow. How about you, Arnold?
Well, I grew up in the West Indies on cricket and soccer, and I still love cricket. I still think of cricket and American football as the two great sports. But I was a sports nut. I came to this country in 1965 in Ohio, and in a sense was introduced to baseball through the Detroit Tigers and
Nice.
Al Kaline and people like that, and I would listen to the radio broadcasts and entered, I think, pretty much fully into the whole business of being a fan of a baseball team. And I went up a few times from my school in Southern Ohio to Tiger Stadium, and then I went to the Boston area to live. And I regret to say I became a fan of the Boston Red Sox. I set aside history and enjoyed the exploits of Kyle Yastrzemski and others. So I was 24 when I saw my first baseball game, but loved it and understood the richness of its meaning as part of American culture. And I'm a quick learner, certainly, where sports is concerned, where sports history is concerned, not necessarily playing a sport, but and then I did the Ash book, his last book with him, and Mrs. Robertson asked me if I would write a biography of Jackie Robinson for the 50th anniversary of the 1947 entry into Major League Baseball. And I was happy to plunge into it and to learn as much as I could about a person who I obviously admired.
Well, you mentioned at dinner the other night that you felt at some points when you were working on the Robinson book that real dyed-in-the-wool sports writers saw you as kind of an outsider as you did your research. And how did you kind of break through that, or did you? Did you just say, I'm a historian and I'm writing it this way?
No. Well, I'm really a literary person. So that, I've written biographies of Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison and persons like that. When I took on the Ash book, there were people in my department who said, what are you doing? I mean, you have a reputation as sort of as a literary scholar. Now you're going to waste it writing about sports.
Waste
I thought
it?
that was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard.
Yes.
I was very happy to be involved in writing about sports. Yeah, but the first conference I went to with Mrs. Robinson, as a matter of fact, had to do with Jackie Robinson and baseball. And yeah, I felt that the sports writers, the legitimate sports writers, thought I was invading their turf, and made it very clear that they didn't appreciate it. I understood that. It was perfectly fine with me. So.
Are sports writers more competitive than other kinds of writers?
No.
No. No, but people assume, I mean, it's a fallacy. I'm treading on tender ground here. You don't have to be president, certainly not this one, in order to cover the president. It's only in sports that you're presumed to need to have done a crackback block on, against John Riggins in order to describe what happened. And that fallacy, you must have played the game. It's one of the reasons women were so unwelcome. But I would say to you that I think being an outsider is a good thing. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what reporters are supposed to be.
Right. I understand that.
Yeah, reporters, like other kinds of writers, are observers first and foremost, curious people who are willing to ask the questions.
But if you look at, say, television reporting about sports, I think when somebody like Chris Carter or someone who has actually been in the trenches, as it were, as a player, says something, somehow you think it has more authority than somebody who's
never
has
been
only
there.
A bookish knowledge in a way.
And sometimes it
sport.
does, and often it doesn't.
Yeah.
Mostly it's pablum, frankly.
Most of it.
It's pablum mostly, the jocks in the box, as Howard Cosell used to call them.
It's no different than politicians who suddenly go on TV to be, pundits. And do they know more than people who've studied politics for decades? No.
And you, David, have written biographies of politicians,
Yes.
as well as sports figures. And one thing that I think everybody has talked about is how important it is in biography to sort of puncture the myth and get to the real person. That's sort of the topic of this panel. Whose myths are harder to penetrate, politicians or sports figures?
Well, the interesting thing about that is that generally speaking, politicians create their own myths, and the public creates the myths for the sports figures. So when I wrote the biography of Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, in very different ways, I had to penetrate the myths that they had created. Clinton on purpose, and Obama more in his memoir, which is brilliant literature, but not biography. And so I had to go back and find out what really happened with, for instance, the story of, in his memoir, he writes about his Indonesian stepfather, who, as a very young man, Barack lived in Jakarta, and his mother had married an Indonesian. And in his memoir, Barack says that his Indonesian stepfather died heroically fighting the Dutch in the battle for independence. And I went back and found out that, in fact, he died falling off the ottoman in his living room when he had a heart attack. Somewhat different. But the point of that is that we all pass along the mythology of our families,
Right.
and we don't always have biographers going back to find out what really happened. But for sports figures, it's the mythology that unfortunately some sports writers and the public creates. So with someone, and they invest their own beliefs into that mythology. So for instance, for Vince Lombardi, who I wrote about, the right wing adopted him as the symbol of discipline and old school philosophy.
Right.
The left rejected him as the symbol of a pathological need to win, and they were both wrong.
Oh,
In
wow.
very different ways. And so the most famous saying of Vince Lombardi attributed to him was, "Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing." Completely misrepresents Lombardi, who said it once but did not coin it. In fact, when I did the biography, I discovered that it was first uttered publicly by an 11-year-old actress in a John Wayne movie talking to Donna Reed. John Wayne was playing this ne'er-do-well coach of a Catholic school in New York that was trying to survive, and therefore hired him to cheat, and he brought in all these professional players to play for the Catholic school. He was also a single father whose 11-year-old daughter was being raised by him. Donna Reed played a social worker who was trying to save the daughter. And so Donna Reed and the 11-year-old went to a football game. They were watching their father win but cheat. And the 11-year-old says to Donna Reed, well, don't you know winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. And that's where it came into public culture, and that's where it was attributed to Lombardi.
Wow.
You broke my heart with that story.
Well, you write a lot about Robinson as a figure, you know, off the field, the sort of third act of his life. How much controversy or pushback did you get in sort of, you know, puncturing that myth or you know, expanding that life?
I sometimes think that if you write about someone and at the end of it, when the book appears, the person doesn't hate you, you've really not done your job. Robinson had such a fascinating life. I was listening to, what is his name? Schreiber.
Yeah, Lionel Shriver.
Lionel Shriver, yes. And she talked about how the body kills you. And it was so profoundly sort of touching about how Robinson had this wonderful body. And the year he stopped being a baseball player, he began, because of diabetes, a 15-year decline that made him a candidate for the amputation of both of his legs near the time he died. So that was, it was hard to write about that, and at the same time write about his various adventures as the right-hand person to Nelson Rockefeller in business and so on. Mrs. Robinson loved the first part of the book, and she said, oh, this is fantastic. It's just what I wanted, a biography of the full man. And then when she read the last part of the book, the second or third part, the last third of the book, she wasn't too happy about it because it was showing Robinson failing more often than succeeding in these various ventures away from baseball. Although he remained, to me, a magnificent person, a magnificent man, leader, generous and I mean, eager to speak his mind, and taking flack as a result, but proud and a generous, inclusive person, a hero.
I think that when I was a little kid, when I learned that Jackie Robinson supported Nixon, I was one of my earliest confrontations with the idea that people are complicated.
Yes. It still surprises people. Oh, you know, he was a Republican, and he supported Nixon over Kennedy, and he had his reasons. And they weren't bad reasons, actually, at the time.
He was a Rockefeller Republican, wouldn't you say?
Did I say?
No, I mean, he did
was
support Nixon, but he
was
was
absolutely a Rockefeller, and not a Goldwater Republican.
An extinct breed at this point.
Yes, lamented.
On that point, Kate, I would say that without saying it morbidly, it's kind of an advantage to write about people who die young, especially athletes, because their afterlife is often just
sad.
Sad, yeah.
Yeah.
Sports biographies, I think, have always been, or up till David came along and Richard Ben Kramer came along, a sort of subgenre of what Mickey Mantle called all that Jack Armstrong shit. And, you know, he looked at me and he said, Jane, you're going to write all that Jack Armstrong shit. He was daring me, in a way, to go beyond that. And in the Babe Ruth book that I wrote, I spent a year before I signed the contract because so much had been written about him, and it was all good. But they all lacked the first 20 years of his life. Now, if you tried to write a book about Churchill, for example, and left out the first 20 years of his life, you'd be laughed out of the Library of Congress. But in sports, there was always a different standard. It didn't have to be scholarly, it didn't have to be documented, didn't even need to be fact. And that began to change with David, and it's now sort of grown up. And I found, particularly with Mantle, he wanted to be seen as he was. He was pleading for somebody to say, you know, you can't talk like that. On the 50th anniversary, this is a story I was telling David earlier, 50th anniversary of Yankee Stadium, they sent out a questionnaire to all the former Yankees, asking them to describe their most memorable, exciting experience ever at the stadium. And Mickey Mantle wrote, "I got a blowjob, but between the third and fourth innings under the right field stands at Yankee Stadium next to the bullpen."
And Jane asked me whether this audience would appreciate it. And I said, yeah, older intellectuals love raunch.
And then he signed it, Mickey Mantle, the All-American Boy. And what that told me, and there were other instances that were grosser, frankly, that I didn't use in the book. What that told me was that Mickey Mantle, unbelievably, had a sense of irony, and that he knew he wasn't how he had been portrayed, and he wanted to be seen as in human proportion. And so after he tried to, that night after he landed in my lap, the next morning I was furious at him. And we went to breakfast. I was surprised he was there because he was so drunk the night before. And he looked at me and I said, you can't talk like that. You can't act like that. Adults don't function like that. And I said, and besides which, when I was 7, I stood outside Yankee Stadium waiting for an autograph, you farted in my face. Which he could do on cue, by the way. It was one of his many talents, documented. So he whips out an 8x10 glossy and he autographs it, "Sorry I farted, your friend Mick." So the book about him really was not a takedown. I mean, David and I were talking about this before. You're not, when you say you're cutting people down to size, it isn't always pejorative. You're trying to give dimension to people who are often described like the balloons in the Thanksgiving parade in New York. They don't have any human form. They're just ridiculously inflated. And after all, that's what a biographer is supposed to do, is give them a human way of being able to relate to them.
How do you get to that human form, though, as a research task? I mean, sometimes you're talking to the athlete, him or herself. Sometimes you're interviewing family members. But I mean, how can you? It just feels like a tough task, especially with Ruth, where not much about his childhood had been sort of publicly available. How did you find that?
Well, I think, and David and Arnold know this for sure, and other writers out here. Maybe it was just news to me, but the digital revolution and the availability of documents, both newspaper collections and archival family collections, have revolutionized reporting. And the things that I was able to find in those newspapers with a click of a mouse, my predecessors, notably Bob Creamer, who was a terrific writer and wrote what up till then was the definitive book on Babe Ruth, they could never have found. So I went to interview Babe's daughter, Julia, who died last March. And we're just talking, and out of nowhere, she says, whispering, because she had this Southern kind of thing about her, "You do know Kate and George, i.e. Babe's parents, were separated." And I said, "No, I did not know that, and nobody else knew that." And then I called up one of his granddaughters, and she said, "Separated, hell, they were divorced." With that one fact, all I had to do was type in Google George Herman Ruth Sr. V, right? For the lawyers in the crowd, V, Katie Ruth. And up pops 150 pages documenting their divorce and the banishment of their son, Babe, to St. Mary's Industrial School. He was an abandoned boy. He was abandoned to build a life and a self by parents who were not poor, contrary to the myth. And it wasn't that they, couldn't afford to keep him. His mother died of alcohol abuse, and the death certificate said exhaustion, but it was alcohol abuse and tuberculosis. And his father had no patience. He didn't have a place for him, so he just sent him off to the brothers and never visited him, as a matter of fact. And Babe Ruth, this is not a story that in Babe Ruth's era anybody wanted to tell. My parents were divorced. My father caught my mother stooping his bartender on the dinging room floor. That's in the deposition of the Babe's father and of the bartender. So that wasn't, today you'd go on 60 Minutes and you'd cry on somebody's shoulder for 20 minutes and everybody would go, wow, great, you survived that. What character? In Babe's era, you didn't want anybody to know. And the sports writers of that era, those who may have been privy to the tale, and I think Grantland Rice probably was, because he was a friend of his, colluded in keeping it private. So people would say to him, "You're an orphan, right?" And he'd slam his hand down and say, "No, I had parents," but he never went further than that. "Oh, you were, an incorrigible. You ran around the waterfront in Baltimore throwing things through windows." No, he didn't live on the waterfront in Baltimore, and he didn't throw things through windows, and he wasn't an incorrigible, and a court didn't send him to St. Mary's. His parents did.
He was an abandoned child.
He was an abandoned child. And once I was able to fill in that childhood, the man he became that everybody knew and the myth that he embraced made complete sense.
For a slightly different take on the same topic, when I was working with Arthur Ashe on his last book, he knew he was in the 5th year of full-blown AIDS, so he was likely to die. But my toughest problem, he said, "I want to write a book. I want to write this book, and I want to express my opinions on all sorts of subjects." And I said to him, "Arthur, you have to talk about yourself. None of these thoughts," I could have said to him, "None of your opinions are really original." But what will give the whole thing a certain kind of substance would be if you talked about yourself, growing up in Richmond, your relationship to your father, the death of your mother when you were 7, and so on. And that fight continued to the very end, this contesting between his resistance to the personal and my own insistence that he had to talk.
How did you get him to open up?
I don't know. I worked on him. I worked on him because I had in my head a sense of what the book should be the basis of the book, and oddly enough, it was St. Augustine's Confessions, where he talks about how he became a sinner, and then he found God. Well, I left out the finding God part, but I wanted Arthur to confront himself in a very intimate way, and there was one moment when he in his it wasn't his living room, it was in his study, let's say, where he finally said, "Well, there was one thing that I feel shame about." And I said, last. And it was about being, it's not as sensational as Mickey Mantle doing it.
Nothing is.
But it was about when people were getting their heads busted down in the South in the civil rights era, he was playing tennis on expensive manicured lawns or courts, and staying away from the fray, and that left him with a sense of shame, which is why toward the end of his life he was arrested a couple times demonstrating against what was being done with the Haitian refugees and at least one other political cause.
It's interesting. Yeah, go.
Sorry.
No, please, David.
The same. So my motto is go there, wherever there is, and especially for when you're writing a book about someone who's not there anymore.
Yeah.
But I think that cultural geography and sociology in understanding why someone is the way they are is incredibly important. So for each of my books, I've rooted myself in the places of their lives. That meant once turning to my wonderful wife and uttering the immortal loving words, "How would you like to move to Green Bay for the winter?" But we did. And for Christmas that year, she posed with a cheese head on her hat and a sign that said, "Help." But it was only through that I could understand the one company town of Green Bay and the obsession with football and how it connected with Lombardy, because it was a very Catholic town as well. And he was so Catholic that while I was in Green Bay, one day I interviewed his very old secretary, who described for me walking into his office one day and seeing him in a priest's garb. And he was just trying it out because he wanted to go into the seminary, but
Wow.
realized it wasn't for him, and then he turned to football. But his whole life was sort of this back and forth between work and play, hate and love, the football versus, and his anger and drive versus what he knew he should be. And so all of that came through in that one little scene that I never would have seen anywhere else. And for Clemente, spending so much time in Puerto Rico, I thought was essential, because in America we think of him in Pittsburgh, but in every possible way, he was the patron saint of Latin American baseball and incredibly proud of Puerto Rico. And it was only through spending so much time there that I was able to really feel it from that perspective.
Robert Caro, memorably moved to the Texas Hill Country, spends 100 pages describing where Lyndon Johnson would grow up, long before Lyndon Johnson was, a twinkle in his mother's eye. So I completely agree with you about place, but there's another iteration about writing about somebody who's alive, and that for me was Sandy Koufax, who memorably did not want me to write the book about him. But ultimately agreed. We made a deal, and it was a deal that I felt, if I disclosed it to readers, that it was an honorable one. I didn't want to write a book about his afterlife, as you described it, even though Sandy's an amazing human being and what he's done since baseball is fascinating. I wanted to write a book about his career, which hadn't been written about much at all, and how it paralleled changes in law and social justice. He's quite left-wing, by the way, raised by a Marxist grandfather when his father left the family. So what he agreed to do, he said, "I don't want to be interviewed for this book, but I'll tell anybody who asks that it's okay to talk to you."
That's great.
Oh, that's a real gift.
And because of their devotion to him, Sandy's friends would not otherwise have cooperated. And they'd say, "I'm not talking to you." I said, "Call Sandy." And the other thing he said he would do was verify matters of fact. And so I could call him. Now, you can only do this with one of the world's most honorable human beings. I could call him and say, "Is it true that Irving Koufax, his mother's second husband, whose name he took, is it true that he never legally adopted you?" Which I had heard. And he said, "Yes, that's true, but he's my father." And otherwise, it would have been months in the Brooklyn Hall of Records trying to find that out. He still says he had nothing to do with the book. He refers to it as an unauthorized biography by a really neat lady.
Which is better than the other way around.
That's very sweet.
Well, he's not an athlete, but I was thinking about Langston Hughes in that context of going where the person was. And, he started out in your hometown.
Absolutely, Lawrence, Kansas.
Which is a wonderful place, and I sort of went there and then tried to follow him, but it was hard because he traveled literally all around the world by the time he was 32, and then he spent this year in the Soviet Union, 32, 33, and I went there and trying to find, imagining that the walls would speak to me.
Yes.
And that was kind of nonsensical in a way. And the most nonsensical moment was when he writes about spending his last evening in Soviet Central Asia outside the tomb of Tamerlane in where is it? I've forgotten now where that Samarkand.
Okay.
And so there I was, standing outside the tomb of Tamerlane in Samarkand, waiting for somebody to speak to me, some spirit. Nothing happened. Nothing. But I was glad I did it in any case. It gave me just a little bit more encouragement, if not insight, into the character.
I love that. It's a lot of, I mean, the amount of legwork that you do that it funnels down to, what's on the page. I mean, how many endless hours, weeks, months, years?
8 for the babe.
8 for the babe.
Years.
8 years. Yeah. How long for Clemente, would you say you worked on that?
My books, for some reason, all take about 3.5 to 4 years.
Nice. You're quick.
But I mean, I took many years for the Langston Hughes, which is 2 volumes, but the Arthur Ashe book. He called me from Wimbledon in '92 and said, I really want to do the book. And I said, okay, but as soon as you come back now, we're going to start doing, I'll come to your home on the Upper East Side and we'll do interviews, and out of those interviews will come a book. So that's Wimbledon in '92. He dies in January of '93. The book
wow.
appears in June of...
So compressed.
I mean, it's amazing that
Yeah.
it all came out. I mean, I was being hounded in a genteel fashion by Knopf and to get the book out.
Yes.
And but it took less than 1 year.
Gentile
I'm doing
hounding
something
is good.
wrong.
Huh?
I'm doing something wrong.
Well,
way.
it's an much easier task to write somebody's autobiography than to write a full-scale, groundbreaking biography as you did in the case of
Thank you.
more than one person. Yeah.
That's right. Well, listen, we have about 10 minutes left for questions, and I think Ben is around here with a microphone. Where is Ben? There he is. So stand up if you want to ask a question, and Ben will come to you with a mic. Ben or this young lady. Any
We have one.
questions?
Up here, Ben.
Oh, okay. Up there.
Thank you all so very much. Just a question about going there. When there's a vested interest in your not. So you already mentioned if you're not an athlete, to be allowed into the world of athletics. But here you're also cutting into 2 other things. One is the myths that other people have of these heroes that they had that you're potentially tramping through. And then, Jane, what you were talking about so much with the babe, how commodified he was. There's actually an economic interest in having him not be the real person that he is. So I was wondering if you could speak to, and if any of you have had that experience of potentially either undercutting the myth or undercutting the commodification, and what challenges may have been thrown up your way from that.
That's a great question. Thank you.
It's different in every case. For me, when I was doing the biography of Vince Lombardi, I was incredibly lucky that he had a really difficult relationship with his son.
It's always good.
And it was never truly resolved, and his daughter, but they were very honest about it. So I didn't have to deal with them protecting a mythology. With Vince Lombardi, the essence of it was that he was really terrific at creating a sense of family out of strangers, out of his team, and making them feel like a family, and a complete failure with his own nuclear family, which is often the case if you think about it with coaches and politicians. And so when I went to them and said, this is going to be the real story, I had no pushback at all, to the extent that Vince Lombardi's son's wife gave me a letter that Marie Lombardi, Vince's wife, had written to the son, excoriating him for their relationship and just revealing all of the internal dynamics of that difficult family. With the Clementes, it was slightly different. There was a mythology built up by his family after his death. His widow, Vera, is a wonderful, warm human being. The sons were a little more protective, and to pierce through that was much more difficult, and often the case. And with politicians, forget it, especially if they're alive.
Yeah.
So, dealing with the reason my biographies of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama stopped before they became president is because I didn't want to deal with all the garbage that their cordon of protectors would try to throw at me. And so I was looking at things that they knew nothing about.
Babe Ruth was a revolutionary in every sense of the word. He reinvented the game of baseball by taking a full swing at a ball and not hitting away and playing what was called small ball or smart ball. But he was also a revolutionary in that he hired the first sports agent, whose name was Christy Walsh, and who had been lost completely to history. And they created for him the model of what you see today in LeBron and whoever's coming up next, of how to sell an athlete as an entertainer, who should be paid not just for the balls they hit out of ballparks, but for the tushies they bring into ballparks, and who should be paid for selling chewing gum that has their name on it. And Walsh's family, which is very messed up and disparate in lots of different parts, gave me access to all of Christy Walsh's letters about Babe Ruth, and I found an accounting ledger in which he documented by the penny, because he took 25% off the top, everything that Babe Ruth endorsed and how much he made, which was how I was able to find out that in 1927, for example, probably the first time in history, Babe Ruth made more money for what he did off the field, $73 million, than he was paid by the Yankees. Not million, 70,000, which translates in, thank you, which translates in 2016 dollars into $12.6 million.
Wow.
So that was a revolutionary moment, and he did become a commodity, and he colluded happily in that effort. If you wanted him to pose with a dead lobster on National Lobster Day, he was your man.
We have a
How about
question.
you?
Just one little story about Jackie Robinson and his relationship to children. Jackie Jr. went to Vietnam, came home, turned to drugs. It wasn't pretty. Rehabilitated himself, and then died at the age of 23 on a Connecticut turnpike in a motor car accident. And Jackie said when at his funeral, he said, I paid more attention to other people's children than my own. And
It's heartbreaking.
it was sort of heartbreaking.
Yeah.
We have a question here.
Hi, Jane. You mentioned in the Sandy Koufax book in particular that he kind of verified a lot of things.
Yes.
And you interviewed so many people for that book. And I just want to know how, the process kind of behind assembling like all those interviews and, using what you're going to use where and what goes into that. And I'm sure that's something for all of you, but especially in that book.
So I was lucky there. I mean, he was alive, and the people who played with him were alive. I think David and Arnold will agree, where you make a list of everybody you would like to talk to, and you go to the oldest ones first.
Smart.
And I made a decision with that book. I made a decision about the structure to recreate his perfect game inning by inning on September 9th, 1965. And so I knew the people who played in the game. I made a list of everybody who played, and went one by one down to interview them about specific balls they hit. The Byron Brown, that was the only ball that came close to being hit fair, was he pulled a ball just past third base. And that was it. That was the only time Sandy was in jeopardy that night. And he, of course, described that at length. Jeff Torborg was his catcher. And I found raw footage that Sandy had asked the team to film. He thought his mechanics were off. So there was a guy from the Dodgers standing behind home plate with a 35 millimeter camera. And I found this, and I thought, what is this? And I could see the 10 on the catcher's back. So I guessed it was Torborg. and went to him and showed it to him. He said, "My God, that's the first inning of the perfect game." First couple of innings, actually.
Wow.
And so it's not fill in the blanks, but if you have a structure like that in advance, it's not chronological, but it is linear. That's how I was able to work on that book. Hasn't worked for every other book.
I'm just going to tell one story about the part about interviewing the oldest people first. My first book was the biography of Bill Clinton, and I was interviewed by Brian Lamb on book notes for that, and his last question was, "Well, what's your next book?" And I don't know
That's
why.
everybody's favorite question.
And I don't know why, and I said, Vince Lombardi. And I hadn't really fully decided yet, but I knew that between Clinton and Lombardi, it was vast acreage. So I got a letter from a woman in New Hampshire named Campion, and she said, "Dear David, I watched you on C-SPAN. You're doing a book on Vince Lombardi. My brother, Rex Reeder, was a hero at D-Day, was an assistant coach at West Point when Vince Lombardi was a coach there.
Wow.
And he's 92 years old, and he has the memory of an elephant." So that was my first interview. The next day, I found him. And he was a wonderful old man who would send me notes in his scrawled red pen. And it was also the time when Bill Clinton was getting in trouble and Paula Jones' story was emerging. And I was subpoenaed to testify at the Paula Jones trial. And I avoided the subpoena by just disappearing, sort of, because there was no way I was going to participate in that. And I got a postcard from Red Reeder in this red scrawl that said, "Dear David, stick by your guns. If they put you in jail, I'll come visit you."
That's amazing.
Well, one thing I have to say is it's not really directly out of what has been said, but one of the toughest things is talking to people and trying to find out as quickly as you could, whether they're telling you the truth or not, because you get a lot of made-up stuff. I don't think that often the people know that they're telling untruths. Maybe some people are pathological in that way. But and that's why I always thought it important to go through the written record as much as possible, the letters, the journals, and so on, and then talk to people, and you then would know almost within 2 or 3 minutes whether this person was really reliable or not. I don't know if you all...
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And it's not only that they might be lying, but also that everybody's memories are imprecise
Precisely.
anyway.
Right.
And so often I found that it's the little sharp thing that they remember and never chronology. So when I was doing a book on the Vietnam War and a battle in that, people would get all the chronologies of a battle wrong, but they might remember precisely that when the first gun came down from the trees from the Viet Cong, I was opening a can of peaches. I trust that.
Yeah.
I don't trust anything about the chronology after the chaos.
I met 94-year-old bat boy for Babe Ruth, who served him at an exhibition game in the fall of 1927 after he hit the 60 home runs, and he took this victory lap barnstorming across the country. And like, as David just said, what he remembered fiercely was the bell calling everybody to school that morning at 8 a.m., only to be told they were going to the game.
Wow.
And how the teachers marched them, single file down to the ballpark, where because of his special status, he was allowed to sit on the field, and Babe and Lou came and patted him on the head. All the other kids were behind the behind the outfield wall, grabbing foul balls and things, and he never got a ball, but he got a pat on the head.
It's beautiful. Are we time? We are all out of time. Thank you, and please thank our panelists.
Thank you.